The sea was black with smoke. Off the coast of Okinawa, April 1945, the horizon trembled under the whine of engines and the crack of gunfire. From the carrier decks below, American sailors squinted upward. Hundreds of Japanese planes diving from the sun, white headbands flashing, wings slicing through haze. Inside the darkened operations rooms, green radar screens pulsed with light, sweeping arcs that caught every movement long before human eyes could see. Operators called out bearings, hands tight on the headsets, their voices calm but clipped. Above deck, the Mark 37 gun mounts rotated in unison, guided not by instinct, but by invisible waves of energy bouncing through the sky. The first kamikaze came screaming and low, its pilot gripping the stick with both hands. He never saw the shells that met him. Radar calculated, proximity fused, exploding in the air before he reached the fleet. Fireballs tore across the gray clouds. Men ducked. The sky rained metal. It was faith colliding with precision, devotion meeting invention. In that hour, somewhere between courage and circuitry, the course of modern warfare changed forever. And even the most determined kamikazes began to realize that America's unseen weapon could see through their final act of sacrifice. By late 1944, Japan's empire was shrinking by the month. The once feared Imperial Navy was shattered, its carriers sunk, and its veteran pilots, the elite who had defined early victories at Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea, were gone. What remained were boys barely trained, flying outdated planes with dwindling supplies of fuel. On every front, defeat crept closer. The Philippines had fallen. Formosa was burning. The Allies had taken the Marianas, placing their long-range B-29 bombers within striking distance of Tokyo. And now, in the spring of 1945, the final battle loomed. Okinawa, the last stepping stone before the Japanese home islands. It was during this time of desperation that Japan turned to the unthinkable. The word kamikaze, or divine wind, was not just a military tactic. It was born from centuries of national myth. The first divine wind had saved Japan from Mongol invasion in the 13th century, when a typhoon destroyed Kublai Khan's fleet. Now, in the face of annihilation, military leaders invoked that same spirit. Young men were told that their bodies could become weapons, their deaths a storm to defend the emperor. They believed that through sacrifice, Japan's fate could be altered, that their final moments could strike fear into the heart of an industrial giant. The Kamikaze Corps was formally organized in October 1944 under Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi. His directive was simple: crash into American warships with precision and courage. Each pilot was expected to destroy one ship, a life for a vessel. The psychology behind this was both tragic and deliberate. Japan's dwindling resources meant conventional warfare could no longer be sustained. Aviation fuel was scarce. Aircraft production had slowed. But what the empire still had was spirit, or so the leaders believed. Propaganda films, school textbooks, and radio broadcasts glorified the idea of self-sacrifice. Pilots were blessed before their missions, given ceremonial drinks of sake, and photographed smiling beside their planes before takeoff, a nation's sons heading willingly toward death. But the Americans were not the same enemy Japan had faced in 1941. In just 4 years, the United States had transformed into a machine of war unlike anything the world had seen. Its factories were relentless, its engineers inventive, and its navy, once underestimated, now stood as a floating fortress of steel and electronics. Behind the courage of its sailors stood a new power: radar-guided warfare. Radar had begun the war as a secret advantage, but by 1945 it had become the beating heart of Allied defense. The system could detect enemy aircraft long before they appeared visually, allowing anti-aircraft gunners to prepare, aim, and fire with unprecedented accuracy. At its core was the Mark 37 gunfire control system, a marvel of wartime engineering. It connected radar, analog computers, and gun batteries into one synchronized brain. When radar spotted an incoming target, the system calculated its speed, altitude, and trajectory. Within seconds, the guns were locked on, automatically adjusting elevation and bearing. To the men operating them, it felt almost supernatural. The guns turned on their own, following unseen movements, guided by mathematics and electricity. Japan's airmen had been trained to exploit human error, to approach under cloud cover, in groups or at dusk, overwhelming gunners with surprise. But against radar, surprise was impossible. Even in darkness or fog, the American fleet could see. And that terrified the pilots who had been taught that courage could overcome anything. In early 1945, Japan launched Operation Kikusui, a series of 10 massive kamikaze waves against the U.S. Fifth Fleet surrounding Okinawa. Nearly 1,100 suicide planes were thrown into the assault over 2 months. The strategy was brutal in its simplicity. Overwhelm the Americans with sheer numbers, hoping that enough planes would slip through to cripple the invasion force. At first, the attack succeeded in sowing chaos. Ships burned, sailors died, and morale wavered. But then the technology began to show its full strength. Each American task force was surrounded by radar picket ships, destroyers stationed miles away from the main fleet. Their job was to detect incoming aircraft and relay information instantly via radio to the larger vessels. The system formed an invisible shield stretching across the Pacific waters. The SCR-584 radar unit, rotating endlessly on its mount, could track planes up to 40 miles away. Operators inside small, sweat-soaked cabins read the screens like seers, calling out altitude and direction with machine-like precision. Above them, the gunners waited, hands hovering near triggers, eyes fixed on the horizon. When the radar beams caught a formation of approaching planes, alarms sounded across the decks. Gun turrets turned in unison, aiming at points in the sky where nothing yet appeared. Moments later, black dots emerged through the haze, Zero fighters descending fast. The guns erupted in organized fury. The Mark 37 system calculated and fired so precisely that Japanese pilots described it as being hit by invisible walls. Shells exploded in mid-air, triggered by proximity fuses, small electronic miracles that detonated when near a target instead of on impact. For the first time, the sky itself became a weapon. What unnerved the kamikaze pilots most was not just the firepower, it was the inevitability. Many described their final missions as flying into a curtain of iron. Survivors captured later confessed that they had never seen anything like it. The guns fired even when clouds obscured visibility, even when night fell. It felt as though the Americans could see through time itself. At the heart of this power was a network of collaboration. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ordnance, the MIT Radiation Laboratory, and the Bell Telephone Laboratories had worked together to refine radar accuracy. They developed not just the technology but the training to match it. Radar operators were taught to interpret subtle changes on their screens, transforming abstract blips into life-and-death decisions. The average age of these operators was barely 20, yet they handled the most advanced electronic systems of their generation. Japan, by contrast, lagged behind in radar development. Their radar sets were limited in range, prone to malfunction, and often deployed too late to make a difference. Where the Americans had embraced scientific innovation, Japan's war doctrine remained rooted in valor and sacrifice. This imbalance of ideology versus engineering became painfully evident at Okinawa. By the time the invasion fleet reached the Ryukyu Islands, both sides understood what was at stake. For Japan, it was the last defense line before the homeland. For America, it was the path to victory, but one paved with blood. Over 2,500 ships, 180,000 troops, and countless aircraft converged on the island. Every radar pulse, every flicker of a screen, meant another minute of survival. The kamikaze pilots, launching from Kyushu airfields hundreds of miles away, flew low over the ocean to evade detection. But the radar waves still found them. Onboard destroyers, young sailors tracked the dots inching closer, knowing that each represented a man intent on dying. There was no hatred in the moment, only tension. The fight was no longer of nation against nation, but of human courage against technological inevitability. As the first week of the Okinawa campaign unfolded, both sides began to sense the outcome. Kamikaze missions grew more frantic, American ships grew more precise, and somewhere within that struggle a realization dawned that warfare had entered a new age, where belief could not blind the eyes of a machine. And in that rising tension between faith and invention, the stage was set for the largest aerial suicide assault in human history, and for the moment when radar-guided guns would forever alter the fate of the Pacific War. The horizon over Okinawa burned for weeks. Smoke from the island's bombarded hills drifted across the water, mixing with the oily haze of destroyed aircraft. Every morning began the same way. The whine of approaching engines, the static hum of radar screens, and the bark of orders echoing through the steel corridors of American warships. Somewhere over that gray sea, faith met its reckoning. Japanese pilots had been taught that death freely given could change the tide of war. But what they encountered in those skies was not an army of men. It was an invisible network, a mind of machines, that watched, calculated, and struck without pause. At the core of it was coordination. Each U.S. fleet formation operated like a living organism. Destroyers, cruisers, and carriers linked by radio and radar pulses formed overlapping fields of detection. Every plane that crossed the line of electronic visibility triggered a cascade of data. Operators shouted bearings. Analog computers inside the Mark 37 fire control directors whirred with gears and dials, converting echoes into angles, distances, and firing solutions. Guns obeyed instantly. What once depended on human eyesight and reflex now operated with mechanical precision, measured in seconds. For American sailors, this system felt like a revelation. For Japanese pilots, it felt like sorcery. Many kamikaze survivors, captured or recorded in diaries, later described a single moment, the eerie calm before destruction. As they approached the American fleet, they saw no muzzle flashes, no obvious defense. Then, without warning, the air around them erupted in perfectly timed bursts. Each explosion hung in the air at exactly their altitude. It wasn't chance. It was radar-controlled fire linked with the new proximity fuse, a technology that transformed every anti-aircraft shell into a deadly sphere of shrapnel. The proximity fuse was the silent partner of radar. Developed in secret by Allied scientists, it used a tiny radio transmitter within each shell. When the emitted signal bounced back from a nearby aircraft, it triggered detonation automatically. No need to guess range or impact. The weapon simply knew when it was close enough to kill. It was terrifyingly efficient and devastatingly effective against the kamikazes. Aboard the USS Laffey, a destroyer stationed as a radar picket north of Okinawa, sailors faced 22 kamikaze attacks in 1 hour. They called it the ship that would not die. The Mark 37 directors rotated endlessly, tracking targets even after being hit. Shells screamed skyward, guided by radar even when the ship itself was shuddering under impact. The gunners could see nothing through the smoke, but the radar never lost sight. Nearby, other ships used similar systems. The USS Missouri, battleship of legend, stood anchored off the coast as a floating fortress. Her radar picked up incoming aircraft long before they appeared as specks on the horizon. Gun crews fired by numbers, not by sight, trusting their instruments completely. When one kamikaze broke through and struck the ship's side, the resulting fireball was brief. The ship's sensors kept running, cold, emotionless, efficient. In contrast, the Japanese airfields from which these suicide flights launched were scenes of heartbreak. Young men, often barely 18, gathered in silence before takeoff. They were given white headbands written with the word Hisho, certain victory. Before climbing into their cockpits, they were handed letters to send home, photographs to leave behind. Mechanics wept quietly as they fueled the planes. The engines coughed, the wings shook, and then, one by one, they rose into the pale morning sky. Most would never return. From the cockpit, the pilots saw the ocean as a vast, endless plain. They flew low, hugging the waves to evade radar. But as they climbed for the final dive, they saw something strange. Ships turning and firing before they could even be seen. It defied logic. They believed the Americans possessed electric eyes. Some even wrote that their gods must have abandoned them, replaced by machines. The battle wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The Americans, hardened by months of kamikaze attacks, developed new defensive patterns. Radar picket destroyers formed the outermost ring, detecting enemy planes up to 70 miles away. Combat air patrol, fighter planes circling overhead, were scrambled immediately once radar picked up the signal. If any attacker slipped through, the inner ring of ships opened fire with radar-guided anti-aircraft batteries. It was layered defense, science made tangible, but the strain was immense. Radar picket duty was a death sentence. These ships were far from the fleet, exposed and isolated. They faced the first and fiercest waves of kamikazes. Many crews died without ever seeing their attackers. And yet, without them, the fleet would have been blind. The Japanese Navy quickly realized this and began to target the radar pickets specifically. Destroyers like the USS Bush, USS Colhoun, and USS Manart el Abele were overwhelmed by massed kamikaze strikes. Even as they sank, their radar operators continued sending reports, marking enemy positions until the sea took them. The irony was profound. Japan's suicide tactics had forced America to perfect a technology that neutralized them. Every attack refined the system further. Each loss taught the engineers something new. In the Pacific, evolution didn't take decades. It happened between battles. What terrified Japanese commanders most was the consistency. Radar-guided fire didn't panic. It didn't flinch. In the chaos of battle, human instinct could waver, but the machines did not. Every incoming pilot was met with the same precision. The more the kamikazes attacked, the stronger the defense became. Behind this precision were thousands of scientists and engineers, many of them civilians who had never seen battle. From laboratories at MIT, Bell Labs, and the Naval Research Laboratory came blueprints, circuits, and fuses that changed the war. The radar systems were tested in freezing labs, refined in secret, and deployed on steel decks thousands of miles away. The operators, teenagers, radio men, and gunners, became extensions of this innovation. There was a quiet dignity to their work. They didn't see themselves as heroes, only as keepers of a rhythm. Each pulse of radar, each blip on the screen, represented life or death. They trusted the unseen world of signals and echoes more than their own eyes. Japanese observers watching from distant command posts began to understand that something fundamental had shifted. Aerial formations that had once broken through with ease were now being shredded mid-flight. The kamikaze's faith-driven approach could no longer breach the wall of science. In secret reports to Tokyo, officers described the American fleet as surrounded by invisible armor. And yet, there were still moments of human defiance. Some kamikazes broke through the gunfire, crashing into carriers, destroyers, and transports. The blasts lit up the night, turning ships into temporary infernos. But even as the flames rose, the radar systems continued to hum. Operators wiped sweat from their brows and returned to the screens. The battle never paused. The technological duel of Okinawa revealed the stark divide between two philosophies. Japan had placed its hope in spiritual purity and personal sacrifice, a nation's soul weaponized through obedience. America had placed its hope in invention, in the cold reliability of science. One side offered its sons, the other offered circuitry. For the kamikaze pilots, realization came in their final moments. Those who missed, those who turned back, those who were captured, all told the same story. They felt fear, not of death, but of irrelevance. Their sacrifice had no power against what they could not understand. As May approached, the air above Okinawa thickened with smoke and loss. Thousands of planes had already been destroyed. The sea was littered with wreckage, fuel slicks, and floating debris. Yet the radar tower still turned, the guns still tracked. It was no longer a battle for territory. It was a war for the future of warfare itself. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Staff studied the reports with disbelief. Commanders could not explain how American gunners fired accurately at night or through clouds. The words radar shigeki, radar firing, began appearing in official documents. Japan's scientists knew of radar, but had never imagined its total integration into combat. By then it was too late. Faith could no longer guide the wind. The divine had met the mechanical, and as the final weeks of the Okinawa campaign began, the kamikazes would throw everything they had into the storm, only to meet the cold, unblinking gaze of a new kind of warfare. The morning of May 4, 1945, broke with an uneasy silence over the Okinawa coast. For hours the ocean seemed still, a deceptive calm before the heavens erupted. Then as the first sunlight hit the waves, radar screens aboard the American picket ships began to light up. Dozens of tiny blips appeared on the green phosphorescent displays, moving fast, converging from the north and west. Within minutes the number doubled, then tripled. Operators called it in with clipped urgency. Multiple inbound bearing 270, range 50 miles. It was the largest kamikaze wave yet. Operation Kikusui. Number 6 had begun, the sixth and deadliest of 10 coordinated mass suicide attacks against the U.S. Fifth Fleet. Over 150 kamikaze planes were launched from Kyushu and Formosa, supported by conventional bombers and fighter escorts. Their target, the heart of the American invasion fleet anchored off Okinawa. The Japanese high command knew it was a gamble, perhaps the last. But for the pilots, this was destiny. Their commanders told them their sacrifice would turn the tide of the war. Few realized they were flying into the jaws of a machine that already knew they were coming. Aboard the radar picket destroyer USS Laffey, the crew went to battle stations before they could even see the enemy. Inside the Combat Information Center, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and sweat. The radar scope glowed, showing movement at every angle. The young operator's hand trembled as he traced the nearest cluster. 30 miles and closing fast. Overhead, the whine of engines broke through the static. The kamikazes were coming in low, fast and furious. The first wave dove out of the sun, sunlight flashing off their canopies. Gunners fired blindly at first, their eyes searching the horizon. But above them, the Mark 37 directors had already calculated every trajectory. The guns swung with perfect rhythm, adjusting automatically to match each target's approach. Shells screamed skyward in thick, deadly curtains. The proximity fuses detonated in midair, turning invisible mathematics into thunder. 1-0 burst apart 50 yards from the ship, its wings disintegrating mid-dive. Another spiraled downward, trailing black smoke before crashing into the sea. But for every plane destroyed, another came. The sky became a storm of metal, fuel, and fire. The Laffey shook as one kamikaze slammed into her stern, tearing through the aft gun mount. Flames engulfed the deck, but the guns never stopped firing. The radar system, despite the blast, kept tracking. A second kamikaze struck the forward turret, its bomb detonating on impact. The shockwave threw men across the deck, their ears ringing, their uniforms burned. Yet even through the chaos, sailors ran back to their stations, bloodied but unbroken. The radar screen still pulsed. The gunner still fired. Above the din of explosions, one sailor shouted, "Keep the radar alive." It was no longer just technology. It was survival. Elsewhere across the fleet, the same battle raged. The USS Bunker Hill, a massive Essex-class carrier, faced a sudden dive from two kamikazes breaking through the fighter screen. Radar had detected them too late. The proximity fuses fired but missed by seconds. The plane struck the flight deck in tandem, exploding in waves of orange fire. Hundreds of crewmen were killed instantly. Black smoke rose thousands of feet into the air. Even as the ship burned, her escort destroyers closed in, guided by radar signals that pierced through the smoke to coordinate rescue operations. The technology's brilliance wasn't in its invulnerability. It was in its resilience. Radar-guided gunnery turned chaos into calculation. In moments where visibility dropped to zero, operators still tracked targets, calling coordinates through the crackle of damaged radios. It was warfare conducted by echo and instinct, by light waves invisible to the human eye. The Japanese pilots, meanwhile, faced a nightmare. They had trained for heroism, to strike fear into their enemies with divine fury. Instead, they found themselves dying in silence, shot from the sky by unseen hands. Many never even saw their targets. One captured pilot, who had ejected before impact, later confessed that his squadron had been wiped out before we reached the clouds. They called the radar the Devil's Eyes. By the afternoon, the ocean around Okinawa had become a graveyard of wreckage. Smoking fuselages floated on the waves. Oil slicks burned across the water's surface. The air smelled of cordite and salt and death. American ships burned too, the Laffey, the Bunker Hill, the Morrison, the Luce. But they still floated. Their guns still turned. Their radars still scanned. The most astonishing thing was the discipline. Radar coordination had made the fleet act as one organism. When one ship's system went down, another immediately took over its detection duties, sharing data through radio channels. In the chaos of combat, hundreds of vessels moved like a single machine. It was a vision of modern warfare, decentralized, electronic, and unrelenting. On the Japanese side, the radio silence was haunting. Commanders at Kyushu received fewer and fewer transmissions as the hours passed. Pilots who had sworn oaths to die for the emperor vanished into static. From their observation posts, officers could see the distant horizon lit by constant explosions. By evening, they knew the attack had failed. The divine wind had not returned, yet the attacks didn't stop. In the days that followed, smaller kamikaze formations continued to hurl themselves against the fleet, but every attempt met the same fate. The radar-guided guns, refined and recalibrated after every engagement, now responded faster than ever. The human margin of error, once the weakest link in anti-aircraft warfare, had been replaced by mechanical certainty. In Washington, reports from the Pacific stunned military analysts. The Navy's use of radar and proximity fuses had created what one observer called a shield of light and logic. For the first time in history, machines were making lethal decisions in milliseconds, decisions no human could process as quickly. It was the dawn of automated warfare, born not from theory but from necessity. Still, the cost was unimaginable. In the 82 days of the Okinawa campaign, more than 1,800 kamikaze attacks were launched. They sank or damaged over 400 Allied ships, killed nearly 5,000 sailors, and injured thousands more. But the Japanese paid a far greater price. Over 7,000 pilots lost, many in training, many teenagers who had never flown combat before. Their sacrifice, meant to terrify, instead revealed the limits of human will in the face of modern technology. By June 1945, the last organized kamikaze waves had been extinguished. The skies above Okinawa grew quiet again. The radar towers still turned, their screens still glowing, but fewer blips appeared each day. The divine wind had met its end, not through firepower alone, but through precision, patience, and progress. Aboard the Laffey, now battered and scarred but still afloat, sailors stared at the sunset in silence. The air was thick with the smell of burnt steel and sea salt. They had seen the future of warfare, and it was cold, methodical, and unstoppable. From the ashes of Okinawa, both nations would carry new lessons. For Japan, the realization that valor could not overcome velocity. For America, the understanding that science had become its greatest soldier. And as the smoke cleared over the Pacific, the world stepped irreversibly into the age of radar, where the unseen ruled the battlefield, and courage alone could no longer decide the outcome. The Battle of Okinawa ended not with a triumphant victory parade, but with exhaustion, a silence heavier than the sound of gunfire. When the last kamikaze wave fell from the skies in June 1945, the Pacific lay smothered in wreckage. Ships drifted scarred and smoking. The ocean was streaked black with oil, littered with the remains of hundreds of Japanese aircraft. The cost of the battle was staggering, but its meaning ran deeper than numbers. It marked the moment when the modern age of warfare, led by precision, intelligence, and unseen technology, had fully emerged. Japan's high command received the reports with disbelief and dread. The pilots they had hailed as divine warriors, the men chosen to embody the empire's spiritual might, had been swept aside by mathematics and electricity. Out of nearly 2,000 kamikaze attacks during the Okinawa campaign, the majority had been detected and destroyed long before they reached their targets. For every American ship sunk, dozens of kamikaze pilots had died in vain. Officers at the Naval Air Command in Kyushu began referring bitterly to the American radar network as Kami no Mi, the eyes of the gods. The irony was brutal. The empire that had invoked the divine wind now found itself hunted by invisible waves of its own creation. Science that could see through clouds, darkness and death on board the U.S. ships. The victory was mixed with sorrow. Thousands of sailors had died defending the fleet. The radar picket destroyers, the lonely outposts positioned far ahead of the main force, had paid the heaviest price. Of the 15 ships stationed in the outer screen, 10 were sunk or severely damaged. They had served as the first line of detection, drawing fire away from the carriers and transports. Their radar systems had given the fleet precious minutes of warning, often at the cost of their own survival. The men who operated those glowing screens had fought unseen battles, measuring their courage not in gunfire, but in patience, precision, and persistence. One survivor of the USS Luce described it as a war of seconds. He recalled how, in the final moments before impact, the radar scope had been filled with blips, hundreds of them, like raindrops on glass. "We knew we were being watched," he said later, "and we knew we'd watch them coming until they hit." The Americans had entered Okinawa believing technology could shorten the war. They left it realizing it had changed war itself. Radar wasn't just a tool. It was a philosophy, an acknowledgement that machines could perceive and react faster than men. This concept, radical at the time, became the foundation of post-war military strategy. Within months, the lessons learned at Okinawa would shape new weapons, new defenses, and eventually new fears. In Washington, military planners pored over the data. The performance of radar-guided gunnery and proximity-fused shells had exceeded all expectations. Reports from the Pacific detailed hit ratios nearly triple those of manually aimed guns. The Mark 37 fire control system, combined with radar input, had turned anti-aircraft fire into a science of prediction. The proximity fuse, once dismissed as too complex for mass production, had proven decisive. Its inventors, physicists and engineers working in secrecy across American universities, were now national heroes. But there was also a growing unease. The efficiency with which the U.S. Navy had annihilated the kamikazes exposed a new moral paradox. For centuries, war had been fought through sight, sound, and instinct, one soldier facing another. Now men killed enemies they never saw, guided by machines that made decisions in their place. This shift from human combat to electronic warfare was exhilarating and terrifying. It marked the birth of a future where distance would no longer mean safety, and courage would no longer mean survival. In Japan, the psychological fallout was profound. The kamikaze campaign had been designed not merely as a tactic, but as a statement of will, proof that Japan's spirit could defy the material power of the West. Instead, it exposed the futility of faith without innovation. The loss shattered the illusion of divine protection that had sustained the empire for years. Surviving officers at Kanoya Air Base, once the heart of the kamikaze program, stood on empty runways surrounded by wrecked aircraft. They watched in silence as the sky, once filled with their divine wind, lay quiet and empty. Interrogations of captured Japanese pilots and officers after the war revealed a haunting pattern. Many of the young men who volunteered for suicide missions had begun to doubt their purpose even before takeoff. They had seen radar's effects firsthand. They knew they were being detected, tracked, and destroyed by unseen forces. One pilot wrote in his diary the night before his final flight, "I do not fear death. I fear being useless." That single line, discovered later among the ruins of a Japanese airfield, came to define the moral collapse of the kamikaze ideal. Their courage was real, undeniable, even beautiful in its conviction, but it was rendered meaningless by a world that had moved beyond courage alone. For America, Okinawa was both a victory and a warning. The radar-guided guns had saved countless lives and ensured the success of the invasion. Yet the battle had also shown the staggering cost of victory in a technological age. Over 12,000 Americans were killed in the campaign. The kamikaze attacks had revealed that even when science triumphed, humanity suffered. The closer the world came to perfection in warfare, the farther it drifted from mercy. In the aftermath, the U.S. Navy began integrating radar as a permanent foundation of its operations. New destroyers and carriers were fitted with advanced systems capable of tracking multiple targets at once. The lessons of Okinawa became doctrine. The fleet that sees first strikes first became the mantra of modern naval power. The same principle that had saved lives in 1945 would, within years, evolve into the foundation of missile defense systems and early warning networks, the ancestors of today's global surveillance systems. Meanwhile, Japan's defeat at Okinawa shattered its military confidence. The realization that radar had rendered its suicide tactics obsolete contributed directly to the decision-making in the war's final months. By August, when American B-29s dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan's leaders no longer believed in miracles. The divine wind was gone. The empire had fallen. But amid the ruin, a strange respect remained. American sailors who recovered wreckage from kamikaze aircraft found letters, family photos, and small personal charms tucked into cockpits. They read them quietly, sometimes leaving them untouched. They understood now that their enemy's bravery had been real, only misdirected. Technology had won, but it had not made the victors feel triumphant. Historians later called Okinawa the final rehearsal for the nuclear age, the last moment before warfare became impersonal beyond comprehension. In that battle, radar had proven that knowledge could defeat faith, that logic could outpace valor. Yet the cost, measured in both lives and innocence, left a scar that no invention could erase. By the war's end, the surviving radar operators returned home to little fanfare. They were neither pilots nor heroes in the traditional sense. Many never fired a gun themselves, yet their work had changed the trajectory of the war. They had seen death coming as green blips on a screen, made decisions in seconds that saved thousands, and witnessed a transformation that humanity was only beginning to understand. In Japan, former kamikaze pilots who survived, either by mechanical failure or by surrender, spent their lives in quiet reflection. Some became teachers, some monks, others simply farmers. When asked later what they remembered most, they rarely spoke of fear or anger. They spoke of confusion, of seeing the Americans fight not with fury but with calm precision. They smiled, one said, while machines did the killing. The Okinawa campaign had ended, but the lessons of that battle echoed far beyond the Pacific. The radar-guided guns that had once been instruments of defense became symbols of an era, proof that the future of war would be fought not with swords or honor, but with signals, frequencies, and computation. The divine wind had met the electric storm, and from that storm the modern world was born. In the fading light of 1945, the Pacific lay quiet again, but the silence was no longer the same. The war had changed everything: how nations fought, how men killed, and how humanity understood power. The battle between the kamikaze and the radar-guided gun was more than a clash of steel and spirit. It was the moment faith collided with physics, and the future revealed itself in pulses and echoes. For Japan, the kamikaze campaign became a tragic symbol, not of glory but of desperation. Young men had given their lives believing courage could alter destiny. Yet in the skies over Okinawa, courage alone was not enough. Against machines that could see through darkness, measure distance in milliseconds, and anticipate movement before the human eye could blink, valor had no defense. The divine wind that once saved Japan in legend had been replaced by radio waves, invisible, relentless, undeniable. For America, radar was more than a weapon. It was the dawn of a new kind of warfare. It taught the world that information was the ultimate power, that the one who could see first, think faster, and strike smarter would rule the battlefield. It was a revelation born not from arrogance but necessity, and it changed the very language of war. But behind the progress there was unease. Those who had operated the radar sets remembered not triumph, but the eerie detachment of modern combat. The enemy became a flicker on a screen, a disappearing signal. Death had become mathematical, efficient, emotionless. The men who watched those screens had glimpsed the future, and it was both brilliant and cold. When the war finally ended, the radar towers went dark, the guns fell silent, and the ships returned home. Yet the lesson of Okinawa lingered, that technology can save humanity or distance it from itself. The kamikazes had died believing their sacrifice would bring honor. The radar operators had lived knowing their invention would bring inevitability. In that contradiction lies the essence of modern war, not in victory or defeat, but in understanding that every advancement carries a shadow, and somewhere, in the static hum of the old radar sets, the echoes of that truth still remain.